Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast. Today I got Dr. Nicholas Peter Lee Allen with us and Dr. Robert M. Price. And we're going to be talking about how much of the New Testament is fake, fabricated history. How do you sort out the real from the fake? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So Nicholas and Robert, thank you both for joining me today. This is going to be a great discussion.
It's a pleasure being here. Nice to see you again, Robert.
Oh, likewise. I'm just here for comedy relief. You're really the star of the show as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's actually, I mean, it's a very big topic, and I wouldn't even know where to begin. So maybe you should start, Jacob, with where you'd like us to begin with this big topic.
Well, my first question for both of you is the term, really, to bring in the term methodology. How would you both tackle this question, I suppose, somewhat differently from one another?
Well, I think in terms of two things, the principle of analogy, which I'm always going on about, what does it look like? Compare the narrative to what you know, what your contemporaries report as real life. Does this match up, or does it match better with fictional or fictive genres? I always use the now worn out, I guess, comparison of a guy turning on the TV and the first thing he sees is footage of a gigantic reptile stomping on skyscrapers. What's his first thought? Is he thinking, oh, I hit the news channel? No, he doesn't absolutely know that there are no giant dinosaurs suddenly going on a rampage. But it's far more likely he will immediately and correctly conclude that this is one of those Toho kaiju movies with Godzilla and Gamera and all this stuff, because he's seen plenty of those. He knows that people make such movies, but it would just be amazingly singular if this were actually happening. So, though he doesn't absolutely know, with a mathematical certainty, there's no real room to doubt it. Well, when I see a story where there is this person, a divine healer, being accosted by huge crowds of people who are demon possessed or sick in one way or another, and it says he heals them all. I'm sorry, there seems to be psychosomatic healing. However that works, there are cases of that. It's hard to dispute. But where a guy can take on a massive group of people and heal every one of them, you're talking about Superman. You're talking about superheroes. Edward Zeller pointed this out, which is the first time I thought of this somehow. He's talking about Acts, a story where Simon Peter is called upon to come and resurrect Dorcas or Tabitha, one of the pious stipendiary widows in the church. Why are they calling him? To do a funeral oration? No, to raise her from the dead. And sure enough, he does, as expected. It's like, this is a job for Superman. To think that you've got somebody who can be relied on to do a miracle for you, it just seems to me, no, we're not dealing even with something like a modern faith healer. We're dealing with a fictional superhero like Hercules characters. So it seems to me that at least you got to say it's mythic, like Asclepius, for instance, but more than that, because this is a guy, a man among men who, however, has superhuman powers. Well, by analogy, I have to think that's what this is too. But then secondly, I think the fact that virtually every gospel story, and several of them in Acts, conform so closely to Old Testament stories of Elijah, Elisha, David, Moses, Joshua, etc. What do you think is more probable? That these miracles actually happened and that eyewitnesses recorded them faithfully and passed them on, or that people simply rewrote widely known, very famous, beloved scriptural stories that they heard in synagogue all the time? It seems to me there's no contest there. So there are a couple of major reasons to think that the narrative is fictional. There are too many correspondences on the one hand, and failure to fit the analogy of verifiable experience. And that has nothing to do, as apologists always allege, with bringing naturalistic presuppositions to the text. It's what Peter Berger, I guess, and others call methodological atheism, not metaphysical. You're just making the best, not forecast, but past cast you can. You weren't there. You don't have a time machine, but assuming a regularity of cause and effect, which is all you know is happening, you can't just say, well, I think it likely that these stories are really reporting outrageously atypical, otherwise inexplicable events. So I think that it's really an open and shut thing. Now, there are a few things reported of Jesus that could have happened to anybody, but very few, and they're usually just lead-in material, so that they depend upon the historically difficult stuff. And it just seems like, just like in a one of Lovecraft's stories, he's one of my favorites. He said, you've got to save the intrusion of the supernatural as a climax, but before that, you've got to ease the reader into thinking that he's in mundane reality. And then whammo. Well, that's kind of what could be factual, usually is explicable that way. And there's precious little of that. Like, what did Jesus do during his spare time, if he had any? What were the real circumstances of his birth? We're obviously not given that. Did Jesus leave any imprint on the events and personalities of his time? Well, you might say, of course he did. Look at AD, BC. But no, ask yourself if there's any plausible connection between Jesus and known historical figures. Oh, yes, of course there were. Herod the Great, and the slaughter of the innocents is obviously based on Josephus' account of Moses. How about Caiaphas? We know he existed. They even found his tomb. Yeah, but with this guy, it's like the Pope skipping Easter Mass to go to a hearing. It's impossible. Pilate, he existed, yeah, but he was a Jew-hating bigot and oppressor. He's not going to say, Jesus, oh, nothing wrong with this guy. I'll do anything to get your permission to let him off. This is ridiculous. Really, no, it's not like Caesar Augustus. They called him the savior, and there was a gospel of his birth, but nothing like this. That was just laudatory, flattering rhetoric, but it's just you'd really have to have some amazing argument to show that any of the Gospels events were events. I think it's obvious they weren't.
No, Robert, I totally agree with you, obviously. The thing that backs up what you're saying, of course, is the problem of the lack of education. If we were having this discussion in the 19th century, for example, and not here in the 21st century, we would have less facts at our disposal to make these kind of arguments, because we would be living under a relative shadow of ignorance. Now we live in a period where we've never been so blessed with information. I just think of the internet. It's a gift from God, literally, and yet it's not used. We live in the most, I don't know, we've dumbed down. We live in one of the most, what's the word I'm looking for? It's an illiterate society, basically. It doesn't read. It doesn't read any of the information that's available. We have the best science we've ever had, and nobody understands it or wants to understand it. And if you had all that knowledge, and I mean somebody like you has it, so to you, you can't see the problem. But to somebody who doesn't have that knowledge, they've got nothing to actually compare this with. And I can give you an example. I mean, you know this example. I'm going to talk about good old Apollonius of Tyana, who was, I think, used as evidence that, you know, Jesus wasn't so amazing, he wasn't so original. But I mean, if I read out what Apollonius is believed to have done to somebody now in our society without telling them who this was, who do you think that I'm talking about? I mean, this guy drank wine in moderation. He walked barefoot in a linen robe. He grew his hair long. He debated with and corrected the priests of Apollo. He had 7 disciples. He knew all languages. He claimed to be immortal. He prophesied, he exorcised demons, he healed the lame, he healed blindness, he cured a rabid dog and a rabid boy, he resurrected the dead. And most interesting of all, at the end of his life, he even had a bodily ascension into heaven. And, you know, when you read that and you compare it with the Jesus story, you see that it's got a similar context, a similar structure. It's a similar tale. And of course, if you know something about history, you realize that we're dealing with a Hellenistic period, which would believe in this sort of nonsense. But here we are in the 21st century, and people would rather believe late Bronze Age reasoning than accept the latest scientific information. I find that very strange. I just don't understand it. If you go to a doctor because you've got a prostate cancer, you go to the best specialist, the best urologist to sort it out. Surely, you don't travel to some distant place with a Mesolithic society and ask them to cure it for you. It doesn't make sense to me that we live in this age of knowledge and science, and we still defer back to texts which are clearly written by people who didn't have a clue how the world worked. Does that make sense? I'm just...
Oh, yes. I mentioned Lovecraft. I happen to be working with my wife on a 5-volume set of Lovecraft's fiction and poetry with extensive windbag commentary by myself. And I think of the beginning of his story, The Call of Cthulhu, where he says, I think he has the author say, he says, has the narrator say, the most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all of its knowledge. So far, the revelations of science have harmed us but little. But one of these days, when it becomes too clear what's really going on in the universe, people will grow faint of heart and retreat into the comforting zone of superstition again. Well, that had already happened with the Scopes monkey trial and all that, but that's what's happening. Some are simply ignorant of it, but others say, oh, no. All I need to know about evolution is that if that's true, the Bible isn't. If that's true, you don't need God, so there's no reason to posit a God. They just have other concerns where they're not starting from ground zero. They're the ones with controlling presuppositions, and there's just no way. These things aren't intellectual questions. Like James Barr says, if somebody converts to fundamentalism by emotion, and that's almost always the way it is, there's no way to get them out of it by rational argument. That wasn't how they got in. They don't have they'd have to get the breadcrumbs to get back out of the labyrinth, and too late, some mouse ate them.
I wonder if I could ask a bigger question here at this point, because a lot of people say people turn to religion because of our innate fear of death. And I was wondering, do you think that might have something to do with it, that people just don't want to accept reality because that is actually uppermost in their mind? Do we actually believe that?
Yeah, I think so. That's why I believe you have all these sophisticated people like William Lane Craig and Mike Licona and so forth. I've debated, obviously, many of these people, and I don't regard them as the enemy. I've become good friends with some of them, but it's clear to me that you've got to defend that resurrection, because if you can show that must have happened, well, now we've got something to hang on to. It's not merely a hope that there'll be life after death and all of that. No, this has proven it. This proves that God broke into human history and in human form died and rose. And so, as Paul says, that's the first fruits of the harvest. And whew, we don't have to worry about just being extinguished. If that weren't on the table, I personally, I'm a mind reader, but I wonder if people would give the time of day to this stuff. You never know what's the hidden agenda. Not so hidden.
Another thing that's connected to this is a lot of people will say, oh, well, that person's religious because they're not intelligent. Now, I don't buy that at all. I have met some very intelligent people. Now, these people run rings around you, all right? I'm talking physicists. I'm talking, I'm not going to mention any names here, but we have professors who are highly rated, dealing with very complex things. They all know about the Big Bang, and they all know how the speed of light works, and they all know how the universe came into being. But you won't believe us. They still believe the Earth is 6,000 years old.
Whoa!
And they keep the two sets of information separately in their brain.
Yeah.
They go off to church on Sunday and listen to these Bronze Age stories, which is absolute fact. And then on Monday, they go back to being professors teaching high-level science. And the people like that actually exist. And it's almost as though there's something in their brain. They got two brains with a wall between them. And the two sides don't talk to each other. And I don't understand. To me, that doesn't make sense, because when I grew up, I always wanted one explanation for everything. You know, if something didn't make sense, then I would say, well, there has to be a better explanation. I'm not saying my explanation is correct. That's not the issue. The issue is trying to put everything into one box. I wouldn't carry around 3 boxes or 4 boxes. You have to put all your eggs in one. You know, I literally would put my eggs in one basket, because it has to make sense. Everything must make sense. That's all cross-reference. But that's the part that gets me down. I cannot understand that. It's not logical to me. It doesn't make sense. And I'm wondering if it's a fear of death or something else that is so dramatic that it forces these people not to think. You know,
there are two things, though. They may have a personal, social community from which they would be alienated if they said, you know, I'm not so sure about this.
Absolutely.
I found that when I got into the critical approach, people that had been friends of mine in church would walk right past me. They were rightly afraid of contagion. It's like why they will not have interfaith or faith and no faith marriages. The other person poses a danger because you know them intimately and vice versa, and you become vulnerable. But I read a thing, a little booklet from Moody Press, I think, called something like "The Appeal of Christianity to a Scientist," and this gave me a little insight, because this fellow was like a scientific thinker, and he explained what converted him, and he liked the idea of fulfilled prophecy. Somebody had sold him this bill of goods, that, you see, in Psalm 22 or Isaiah 53, it predicts it, and over here in the New Testament, it happened. Wow, okay. I mean, to them, that's data, and they have no sense of historical method or literary criticism. So if it can be made into nuts and bolts, then, well, it's scientific. No, afraid not.
No, I have life, I've come across a number of people, especially youngsters, who come up in very, very strict religious families. And they realize when they get to about 19, 20 that there's something wrong with the story.
Mm.
And they know that if they were to literally come out of the closet, okay, and say this to their parents, they would be excommunicated. I've seen it. And so what they often do, and I speak to them, they say, we go to church, we just pretend everything's fine, and we don't rock the boat. And that's what happens. So in other words, you've got a group of people living a false life amongst these other people. Now that is not healthy. It cannot be healthy.
Yeah, you know better, but you're willing to speak. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. There's something that I find interesting in this regard is somebody like Albert Schweitzer, who was no Orthodox Christian. I was watching the Dick Van Dyke Show again the other night from the 60s, and Rob Petrie speaks about Albert Schweitzer, a tossed off comment about him being a great humanitarian, as indeed he was. And I thought, the audience, God bless him, if there is one, have no idea of who and what Schweitzer was. He was like a Superman who had 4 earned doctorates and slept only a couple of hours a night and almost single-handedly created this hospital in French Equatorial Africa. And why did he do this? Why did he give up the cultural life of Europe, where he was well known and all that, to go into this hell pit of savagery? And the reason was clear. He said that the voice of Jesus bade him to go. He said, the first half of my life has been great, illustrious, pleasant. From now on, I got to take up my cross and follow Jesus. There was no fundamentalist. He said Jesus, the historical Jesus, is an embarrassment to modern theology. But that didn't matter. The story, the character in the story was so galvanizing, and what he is portrayed as saying is so penetrating that, okay, wherever it came from, there's the challenge, and damn it, I'm going to take it up. It's not like you've got to believe it to find the power of it. And in fact, it's insulting to it to think you do. It's like, oh, you mean, I wrote this thing once, what was it, a graveyard chat or something, where the women go to the tomb looking for Jesus, and the young man says, you just missed him, he's risen. And are you sure? And ladies, I get the impression you almost hope he wasn't. What's going on? Would it be because you think that if he didn't rise, you're under no obligation to do the will of God? I mean, you're only doing it because you want the ticket to heaven? Oh, no, not me. That is so childish, the old cookie jar morality. Again, I'm speaking disparagingly, and I don't mean to do that. But you have to be like the Bodhisattva and not say what does the Sanhedrin say in John? There's a multitude that knoweth not the law is accursed. No. That's out of the question. You're being stupid in another way if you do that. But the plight of these people is that their own doctrine sort of pushes them into staying with a superficial view of things, and they don't have to in order to take it. Like Niebuhr said, you can take it seriously without taking it literally. And but people don't seem to realize that. I know it's hard to embrace that if you've been raised on thinking now you've got the golden ticket to heaven.
I must say, personally, when I look at the different sects of nascent Christianity and Nazarenism, say in the 1st and 2nd centuries, before it became literalist dogma and written concrete and you shall not disagree, okay, it was far more interesting because you had all these lovely blends of religion and ideas and Gnosticism feeding in with myths of Mithraism, and it was more open. It seemed like there was more discovery. It all, as you know, 325 is when that all came to an end. But it seems that somehow Christianity has lost something when it became so literal. Some of those earlier ideas, influenced by Plotinus, for example, and Plato, are far more interesting. It seems like a natural extension of Greek thinking, but then it hits a brick wall. It becomes complete gobbledygook nonsense. And that's the thing that survived. That really gets me down.
I just read some Catherine, I think, Nixie's book, The Darkening Age. And she shows this horror story of how when Christianity took over the empire, it became like the Taliban. And you had rioting and lynchings and vandalism, and we don't want no statues of the gods, and the philosophers had to hightail it out of the country and so forth. And I thought, well, this is what has happened with Islamism. It's just a know-nothing, vicious bigotry. Not all Muslims are like that, but a significant minority are, and they form a threat to anything else these days. And
Christianity's got nothing to be proud of. If you go back, it was equally destructive and fundamentalist. And when I was raised, we were taught that people like Saint Augustus was such an incredible doctor of the church, and what an incredible thinker he was. And then you do some reading and you realize that he was a very strange man indeed. I mean, he justified Christian violence, basically, against non-Christian, because Jesus had used a whip in the temple. That kind of logic now starts to feed in. And Martin Luther's another one. I mean, Martin Luther starts off.
I was just thinking of him. You read my mind.
Totally open-minded, wanted to try and involve the Jews. He wanted to convert all the Jews to his new, his wonderful message. And of course, the Jews said, "So we're not interested." And the next thing that happens, he vilifies them. And he starts writing text where he says things like, if you hang a Jew, you must hang him 7 times higher than the average human because that's what they deserve. This absolute hatred. And then they're proud of being Christian. At the same time, they're actually almost glad the other people are going to hell, because they're so good. Everyone else is so bad. That to me is not being led by the Spirit, if there is such a thing.
There's this great line in what's his name? I can't believe it. The guy who wrote C.S. Lewis and John Beversloss wrote C.S. Lewis and the Search for Rational Religion. And he talks about how what he calls the chop-licking attitude of Tertullian and others, thinking of how great it's going to be as you're munching your popcorn and watching the torments of the damned. You think this is Christian? Well, of course, they can quote plenty of passages about people going to hell, but that's why it's incoherent. It's schizophrenic. And as a result, so is their faith. They may be sweetness and light on some things, but their God is like Abraxas, good and evil. And so are they. I mean, your God is going to be your moral paragon. And you don't want to wind up being holier than God. Because then you say, well, what kind of a God is this? But that's what they ought to be thinking. I was out at Wheaton College once, and Paul Little was there. He was a big apologist at the time. Somebody asked him if he thought Gandhi went to heaven. And he said, oh, yeah, he did, provided he accepted Jesus as his personal savior on his deathbed. I thought, in other words, he's frying in hell right now. Because they don't want to say, well, look, the guy was very Christ-like, because that'd be salvation by works. Oh boy, I wrote a book called Jesus Christ Superstition, where I tried to point out you don't need this garbage to be a Christian, and you're making a laughing stock out of Christianity. And worse, don't do it. Drop that stuff, and you still have plenty of Christianity left.
Well, we're going to discuss what physical, if you like, evidence there is for, shall we say, the inaccuracies in the New Testament. One thing I just want to mention, I originally was an art historian in my life, and we, of course, used to study the artifacts made by the early Christians. And there's something very interesting about texts, written texts, because I believe everything is a text. I'm very Derridean in that sense, all right? I believe everything is text. It can be read and interpreted. Doesn't mean your interpretation is correct, but everything can be interpreted. Now, when you look at a text, a written text, and if you're not awake, you're not going to notice the little subtle interpolations and the expurgations and the rewrites that have happened as something develops, like Christianity, for example, like a theology that's developing. And they're writing it on the move, okay? And we all know about the criterion of embarrassment. I mean, we often use John the Baptist baptizing Jesus as an example of that, because the earlier Gospels, Jesus is quite happy to be baptized by John, and as we proceed through the Gospels, that becomes less likely because the religion has changed, and now you don't want God being baptized by a lesser being. So when you get to John, it doesn't happen at all. Okay, so that's an example. But that didn't happen overnight. That took centuries of development. People writing a text, rewriting the text, fixing the text. All right, that happened. But if you read any conservative scholar, they'll tell you these Gospels were written in 70, and these ones in 80, and these ones in 90, and it's all fixed. You look at the artwork, Jesus is presented as a normal human teacher right up until the end of the 2nd century. It's only at the end of the 3rd and the 4th century that Jesus starts to take off the ground and wear halos and start looking like a deity. So we already know that Jesus moved from being a teacher to a deity in the Gospels and also the other supporting texts like the Acts of the Apostles. But that didn't happen in 50 years. The artwork tells you it happened over 250 years. The texts tell you it happened very quickly. I think that is very good evidence for the interpolation, because if the texts, the written texts, don't agree with the artwork, then you can't forge artwork so easily. I mean, there are sarcophagi where they have carved beards onto women's faces to try and sell them for more money as being, the apostles. But you can tell it's been done if you know your art. You can see it's been fiddled with, but you can't see that with a text unless you're very much big. So there's already a problem with the New Testament is that the dating is all wrong. The original oral tradition may be very old, maybe even older than we think, but the actual text that we're reading has been through so many hands and so many thought processes that if there's anything left in there that actually makes sense, it's very deep. It's very difficult to extrapolate from that something that's plausible. And I could end on talking about Luke Acts. The whole of Acts, you often, if you read a conservative scholar, they'll tell you that Luke, who wrote Acts as well, or the school that wrote Luke Acts, rather, let's call it that, because we don't know who wrote Luke Acts, but let's just pretend Luke did it. They say that Luke was a brilliant historian, right? But if you actually read Acts, the history doesn't make sense. Some of the events are 40 years out. They're the wrong way around. They've been presented as a couche to surround the didactic material that's teaching somebody to adopt the faith. And the realism, the naturalism of the history makes it look believable, if that makes sense. It's a literary trick.
Yeah.
So you mention the census, all right, and then you talk about what happened within the census, and then it all makes sense because the census happened, so therefore the other stuff happened. You know,
Yeah.
you don't question it. And my opinion is that after reading Luke, Acts through that lens, I've come to the opinion that the early Nazarenes who were being told this stuff, they probably couldn't read it themselves. They're probably illiterate. There was probably a reader who read these texts to the illiterate masses. And those people didn't have the knowledge to even know that what they were being read was false or was historically inaccurate.
Yeah, how the heck would they know?
It has to be like that, because if there had been one person in the congregation who had even half, read even anything in his life, he would say, well, hang on a minute. I mean, you're talking about that event, but that event happened 40 years before, not 40 years after. Or, there'd be somebody questioning, wouldn't there, in a normal society? But now, if you look at it, nobody questioned it, for 250 years? That worries me. That really does. It tells me what sort of people were being converted in those early years. What was the education level? And the other thing, I'll end on this, is that the people who could write Greek at that time, and it was very bad Greek, let me tell you, the Koine Greek that's used in the New Testament is actually really bad Greek. It's even got spelling mistakes. That the person who wrote Acts was obviously taught Greek reading Homer. There's no doubt about it. And the Homeric pattern runs through Acts, if you've got the eyes to see it, because that person learned Greek reading Homer, and so he presents his case in a Homeric terms. So when you put all these things together, you realize there's something very strange is going on here. It's as I say, it's a mishmash of ideas. You've got layers of interpolation and redaction going as the theology is changing. You've got places in the New Testament where they've forgotten to take something out, which is now going to be an embarrassment, because now they don't believe that anymore. And then that gives rise to people coming up with ridiculous theories to explain it. And the Catholic Church is a good example where they have to now explain, how is it possible that one human being doesn't have original sin? So what do? Because Mary's going to be the mother of God, but she doesn't have original sin. Well, if God could do that for one person, how come the rest of us have got to suffer original sin? Then they make up a story to explain why she doesn't have original sin. And that becomes a mystery. You don't have to explain it. It's a mystery. Just believe it. Have faith. And so it goes on. And it gets more and more convoluted. It's like the person who tells a little lie and then forgets that he's told the lie. And then 2 weeks later, he gets asked something, he tells another lie, and then he's got to start covering his ass, literally, because he's now becoming deluged with all these, these different narratives. That's where we are now. We're in this, like a morass, of layers of crazy stuff. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, like the Immaculate Conception, post-biblical development is a great example of that, where, wait a minute, she can't be sinless in the same way because she's not a goddess, and so forth. So I guess God must have stopped the transmission of original sin from her parents, who did beget her the usual way. And Schleiermacher said, he took the bull by the horns there and said, Jesus had a natural birth, but God made it an immaculate conception, not a virginal conception. Well, so he just decided to collapse the difference. Let's simplify it. But of course, what right do you have to do that if it's a canonical story? But yeah, that's
well, you know about virginitatis in perpetuum. The whole idea is that after Christ had passed through the birth canal, Mary became a virgin again forever. Yeah. So that's now taught as a doctrine,
Sort of implies
you can have your cake and eat it.
Yeah,
literally.
Yeah, or your communion wafers and eat them too. Yeah, boy, it is. I always like to quote, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to believe." There's just, you're implicating yourself in and all sorts of stuff. It's kind of like Ivan Karamazov explaining to his brother he just cannot come back to the church if he wants to maintain any integrity, because he'll become complicit in all of this baloney, and especially, God must have a good reason for allowing Auschwitz. If I have to go along with a party line, like a spin doctor for a political candidate, I'm sorry, you can keep it, because you're going to lose your soul in order to save it. You can't afford to do that. Oh boy, what a weird paradox. Gee. Now, unrelated to this, I'm going to burst if I don't ask, is there any way on earth I can get a copy of your book on Josephus? Because they don't seem to have it in any online book dealer.
It doesn't. I'm just trying to think who published it. I think it was published by Cambridge Scholars. Have you tried getting hold of them?
No, I'll do that. You mean Cambridge University Press?
No, it's not Cambridge University. Cambridge Scholars are up north near Durham. I don't want to lie to you. It'll come to me. Oh, it used to be a coal mining area in the old days. It's near Durham. I know that. It's up in the north of England.
Okay, I'll look it up.
Yeah.
Thanks
but
for
I
the
have
lead.
seen it. I have seen it for sale on other booksellers' places, and you probably get. But you know, Robert, I actually have about 4 or 5 copies, so I could. If you can't find it, I will send you one. How's that?
Oh, I will look though. Yeah, thank you.
Or maybe I've even got the PDF version I can send you. That'll be even quicker.
Yeah. Oh, I love
the whole point of that book was based on a doctoral thesis, and you in fact feature in that thesis. When I first came across you, Robert M. Price, the first time, and you had a lot to say about the mysteries of Mithras and how you believed that the early Christians were strongly influenced by that, and that's something that I totally support. I mean, if you have ever visited any of the old churches in Europe, especially in Italy, a lot of them are founded on an older church, medieval church, or going back to the 5th century, and then that's on top of Mithraism. They all grow out of each other. And, the fact that the original church, calls the priest a father should already send off, light bulbs. I mean, that was the name of their priest. So you can see the crossover is very much there. The baptism, the Eucharist, it's all taken from the mysteries of Mithras. So even
Christmas, though that was a later appropriation, but apparently
Mithras' birth date was 25th of December, and somebody once said in the 4th century Mithras became a Christian.
Oh boy. Wow.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. There it is. It's such a pity we don't have any of their liturgy, because we've got a lot of artwork, but as you know, to reconstruct what they believed is very difficult. But fascinating stuff.
What is the so-called Mithras liturgy? That
we don't have it. I mean, because I'm presuming, there's 2 possibilities. One, it may have been oral, or secondly, it may have been written and destroyed by certain parties who didn't want it around, because a lot of stuff was destroyed at that time. But what we do have, of course, I think there are some comments on it, but we have a lot of artifacts. We have a lot of sculptures and reliefs, and so it'd be a bit like if somebody came to this planet in 3,000 years and just found a lot of crucifixes lying around. They would have to now work out what these people believed. It's quite difficult. Yeah.
I was just noticing last night there was a split screen with 2 of the commentators, and both of them were wearing crosses and not crucifixes. And I mean, either way, you'd wonder, what is this, a geometry cult, or what's the deal with this guy? Yeah, boy. There's some interesting science fiction written about that in the distant future, or aliens. Say, well, what's going on here? What were these people all about? Of course, we're still in that position.
Yeah, so now when we talk about other reasons to, I wouldn't say doubt, but to at least question the authority of what you're reading. If you read the New Testament from cover to cover, literally, and you don't ask too many questions, you have repeats in that document of certain events that happened. And of course, we know that if you have an oral tradition and you have folk tales and people have different versions of it, if they all get published together, like we have with the Hebrew Bible, you end up with some very strange things happening. For example, if you read the story of David meeting Saul, you have three versions of it because you have three different bits put into the same book, and they don't work out. I mean, you have Saul saying, "I don't know who David is," and the other one he meets him, so it's confusing. But there's a reason for that. And in the New Testament, I picked out 178 contradictions in the text. Okay, there are more. A lot of them are just conflations, but some of them are quite amusing as well. So I just thought I could take this at random. In John 17:12, Jesus lost only one disciple. Okay? But in John 18:9, it says Jesus lost no disciples. Right? Same book, same author. Nobody who was doing the redaction bothered to check that for some reason.
Yeah.
Doesn't that worry you? I mean, if you're writing something, you would check that, wouldn't you? I mean, the New Testament's not a big book. It's an eighth the size of Josephus's writing. It's not that huge. It's not like you're going to forget that.
And sometimes you see...
There's another common one when something happens before an event or after an event. So, for example, the upset in the temple occurred at the end of Jesus' career. That's Matthew. But John says it happened at the beginning of his career. All right? That you find that very often in this book. Somebody will meet somebody, but it happened before an event, and the other one will say it happened after the event. That's a very common problem that you find. At the time of the ascension, there were about 120 brethren, according to Acts. At the time of the ascension, there were about 500 brethren, according to Corinthians. Okay? Again, if I was in charge of a Christian group and I was putting out this didactic material to teach people, to bring them to Christ, I'd say, for God's sakes, just sort out this, speak the same thing here, you know? I mean,
get your story straight. Yeah.
I'll give you the extreme, an end on that, because you can. There's some of them are very amusing. Jesus said that he would judge. That's John 5:22. Jesus said that he would not judge.
Right.
That's John 8:15. Jesus said that the Father judges. That's John 12. Jesus said that the Father does not judge. That's John 5:22. Jesus said that his disciples would judge. That's Luke 22. And you can go on and on. I mean, they're probably very innocent mistakes, but they show that there's no consistency. And if you really believe that some divine being is trying to lead you on the right path, they need to be a little bit more consistent, I believe. You know, I always say to people, if there really was a deity that wanted you to know the truth, the absolute truth, they would write it on your heart. You know, God doesn't write texts. You know, people write texts, and we are very flawed beings in that sense.
We see
I think that a lot of the inconsistencies result from you know how in First John it says that they went out from us, so there's been this docetic schism in the Johannine community. I think that's reflected in First John itself on the question of perfectionism. If you're born of God, you cannot sin. You don't ever sin. But then it says, if anybody sins, don't worry about it. We have an advocate with her. What's going on there? I have to assume that we have a combined version of two different two different versions.
Doesn't First John claim to be written by the author says we wrote this, like Warren Carter says a committee wrote First John, and in the Gospel of John you look at the end of it, it says, and we know his testimony is true. So it's kind of like a group of people wrote the Gospel of John. It's more like a co-authored anthology, something that I think canonical Paul could be too. Because if you look at Paul's letters, 8 out of 13 of the letters attributed to him. I'm not saying 14 because he was the count, so 13. Yeah. 8 of them either have two. The majority of those 8 have 2 authors. So 6 of them have 2 authors. 2 of them have 3 authors, 1 and 2 Thessalonians. And the only 5 ones that are not co-authored is Galatians, Ephesians, 1, 2 Timothy, and Titus. So I just wanted to throw that in there. But
Jacob, does that include the fact that some of the letters from Paul have been combined from more than one source, so that you end up with a nice didactic message encapsulated in a short letter, but it contains information from more than one source? Are you saying that? Does that have 3 different authors, or is it Paul, whoever Paul was, speaking in 3 different letters that have been recombined?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've kind of asked myself similar questions. I've had others on the show that have talked about quasi-similar situations, like Frank Hughes. He thinks that 1st and 2nd Corinthians were 8 letters that were compressed down to 2. He did a book with the late Bob Jewett, The Corinthian Correspondence, in which he makes this argument. I know Bob Price has also talked about 1 and 2 Corinthians being a patchwork quilt, and Philippians 2, isn't that right?
Not about it. I mean,
yeah.
What about the identity of Paul? Well, since he is the founder of Christianity, do you think he's a real person? Do you think he's a committee? Do you think he's a...
I did a show recently called, let me look at the title so I don't get this wrong. It was titled, How Many Pauls, All or None? I did this a couple of nights ago with James Valiant and Douglas Del Tondo. And I was going through 3 different chronologies given by Paul in the early church. Now, a lot of people just don't know about this. But Clement seems to insinuate that Paul died really early in the 1st century, not in the mid-1st century. Like, one could make an argument it's more like the 30s AD. Whereas the Acts of Paul clearly has Paul dying under Emperor Nero in the AD 60s, which I think is completely copied from Josephus, because in Josephus, he talks about Saulus and Costobaros being brought before Emperor Nero in Achaia. And then after that, they're never mentioned again. And that's kind of reminds me how Acts ends. Like, it ends of a plot hole. The story's not finished. And many will say, oh, well, Acts was just about to talk about Paul's death, but it skipped that part. Well, you kind of get that impression from reading Josephus when he talks about an individual called Saul who went to go see Nero, and then I think kind of insinuated that he was knocked off the map. So it's interesting how Acts is fictional history, but one can see that he is gearing the chronology off of that individual in Josephus, who's obviously not the original Paul the Apostle, but nonetheless has been conflated with him based on Acts.
Often the history in Acts is I wouldn't say accurate, but it's talking about actual events, but it gets them in the wrong order, mixes it up. That's the point.
Yeah. One of the arguments would be with Feudus, but what's interesting is that Josephus does mention a Feudian in 6 BCE who was revolting and against Herod the Great, I think, and so that could be why Acts fought. Feudus was before Judas the Galilean, but he spelt the name differently. He spelt the name after Feudus, who was after Judas the Galilean, which would definitely give the impression he made a mistake. He might have even confused Feudus for Feudian, for all I know. That could explain it.
The spelling in the New Testament isn't good, as I say, in all cases, and I'm quite sure that people had more than one way of spelling things.
Oh, yeah.
It's another very recent phenomenon in human history to actually have very strict rules of spelling. I mean, if you just look at Victorian or Georgian English, you can see the different spellings, in the same period. So that doesn't worry me too much.
Right.
What was I going to say now? Getting back to Paul. The impression is given that Paul was such an incredible scholar that he was almost Sanhedrin level jury. And he makes a statement that he's a Pharisee. He also claims to be a Roman citizen, which I find a little bit difficult to, understand. And then he tells us that he's told it was the high priest, wasn't it, who told him to go to Damascus and persecute Christians. Okay, the high priest at that time was a Sadducee.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you want to know, why would a Pharisee, who's top scholar in the country on the Sanhedrin, listen to the high priest of the Sadducee to go and do something totally un-Jewish, like persecute people in another town? And remember, it's all under Roman rule, which means you can't just get up, drive out of Jerusalem to Damascus. It's not like an open season there. So those to me are big contradictions. It doesn't make sense. Again, it's like there's more than one idea coming together there.
Speaking of big contradictions, how about Jerome? That's why sorry if I interjected. I was just going to briefly mention Jerome. A lot of people don't know about this, and I was telling Bob Price about this recently, that Jerome has this story. This was noted by some scholars a while back, like from Charles Travers Wood and others that were pointing this out, that Jerome talks about an individual called Saul of Giscala, who becomes Saul of Tarsus, and then he becomes Paul. The problem is when Jerome said that happened, Jerome elsewhere in his work says that Paul died under Emperor Nero, martyred. That same old crap that everybody is familiar with practically. Oh, but he then goes off the train tracks when he brings up Saul of Giscala, who left Giscala to Tarsus with his family after the entire land was laid waste by the Romans and the Judeans were expelled across the world from their land. I'm like, wait a minute. That could only be after AD 70. Are you kidding me? So Jerome is now saying there's this Saul of Tarsus was living after AD 70 and wrote these letters.
It's got the date for the Jewish expulsion too early as well, which is a little interesting. Yeah.
It makes me think that Jerome is preserving a tradition that I suspect has truth there, because if you look at canonical Paul, because I think it's true, you look at canonical Paul, you can see allusions to the Jewish war. Even scholars have pointed this out. It'll say 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16 is an interpolation, because there's no way Paul wrote that before the war. How could he say the wrath of God has come upon them utterly?
Yeah.
The Greek word telos, indicating finality, a conclusion, or the final wrath of God. Well, how could Paul say such a ridiculous thing before 70 AD? Oh, well, if it was actually afterwards, that makes a little more sense. How about that argument in 1 Corinthians? The temple is inside you. You don't need a building subject to the flames.
Which is a modern Jewish concept.
Yeah.
That's definitely a modern Jewish concept. That's Which again comes to the point I keep saying is I think a lot of the stuff was written much later than what we think. Much later.
I agree.
Yeah, and it's people don't want to hear that, but
why was Clement so ignorant? This is an answer I can't get. Why was Clement? If this is crazy, you got one person over here that really don't know what they're talking about, saying, "Oh, none of this is credible." Like, y'all understand. Y'all do not understand what's going on here. Even among secular scholars, there's this huge dogmatic bubble where, how dare you say this? This very fundamentalist-like mentality. You can't think like this. Like years ago, I was actually saying all these things I'm saying right now, practically. A lot of it. But then I stopped in 2023 for a couple of years because, it was kind of fear, to be honest. It was fear. I realized, what am I doing? Let me just say what I gotta say, because this is a problem. I can't go along with this.
Mm-hmm.
So when I look at these letters, there's clearly evidence that canonical Paul knows the temple was destroyed. I just don't know how one can get around it. That's why you have scholars say, "Oh, these are interpolations into the so-called genuine letters of Paul." But the problem is you can't find a manuscript of 1 Thessalonians where that wrath of God's missing. So that's the issue. What if the whole thing is later?
That's
not just
power.
that little, not just conveniently that little piece.
Right.
Oh, let's toss out the problem. The rest of it's good. I don't think you really solved the problem.
But they do that with the Testimonium Flavianum, right? Gee, as it stands, this isn't very helpful. But if we just assume that we can razor blade out the bad stuff, the text becomes usable again. Is there any manuscript evidence for that? They appeal to Arabic versions that others say are condensed and so forth. But it just seems to me it's surgical.
I can tell you as a fact, there are 89 words in Greek that make up that testimonium. And in those 89 words is a complete confession of the Christian faith. Everything is in that confession. You could actually, if you said that thing out loud, you basically become a Christian, all right? It contains all the elements of conversion. It didn't appear in any version of Josephus until late 4th, early 5th century. And is it just a coincidence that Eusebius mentions it verbatim twice in 2 separate books? And in both versions, it's the same words, identical, except in one, I think there's one word, he uses a different ending in Greek. Okay? So there's no doubt in my mind. Just Eusebius wrote it, right? It's in there.
Yeah.
And he had to find a place to put it in. So he waited until he heard about Pontius Pilate, and he says, "Oh, by the way, at this time there was a white man." Yeah. And everybody buys it. And the funny thing is, if that hadn't been in Josephus's text, I don't think Josephus's text would have survived as well, because they've survived because they've been protected. They've been protected because they are the only evidence they've got for an extra biblical Jesus. And unfortunately, there's no other evidence for it.
Well, while Bob remembers what he's trying to remember, I'm going to bring up real quick. I just want to finish my thought on Clement. Clement doesn't seem to know about canonical Paul. And then he talks about Paul being imprisoned 7 times. He starts talking about stuff that you do not get from the letters, any of them. Then he talks about, Paul had a problem with Cephas and Apollos, but doesn't seem to make any mention about John, one of the pillars of the church. Okay, he's not. In fact, the letter to the Corinthians is the only one that Clement even says he got anything from a letter of Paul from. All the other alleged allusions to the canonical text, like Paul going to Spain, because Clement talks about Paul going to the furthest west of the empire, He doesn't say he got that from a letter. It's only the parts where he is talking about stuff that resembles what we see in 1 Corinthians does he say he got anything from a letter. Why does he carefully make that distinction? Oh, I'll tell you I got this from a letter, and all that other stuff I don't tell you I got from letters. That's strange. Where is he getting it from? It's not from our text. I think we're missing something here. We've lost a lot anyway.
There's another thing I want to throw in here. And I actually talk about this in my book because it was something that's always been bugging me. If you study the history of Judaism, there's no doubt that there was already a climate in the 2nd century BCE onwards for especially Jews looking towards God's new kingdom, the end days, trying to strike a new covenant with God, trying to find out why they were still oppressed people. And the apocalyptic writings set the stage, if you like, for something that's eventually going to become nascent Christianity. It's already there. And if you take the New Testament literally, you have Jesus dying in 33, and then about 30 years later, the whole Mediterranean world is Christian because of the sterling work done by Paul and his buddies. I don't buy that. Sorry. It's just not possible. A handful of men, running around, to Odessa and, up north, down south. And we're told by about 70, there's all these huge Christian communities or Jewish Christian communities all over the Mediterranean. It's not possible unless the groundwork had already been done before the time of Jesus. That is more realistic. If you read, for example, the Wisdom of Solomon, it's already in there. It talks about God sending wisdom and she was rejected by mankind, blah, blah, blah. And it talks about the end days. It talks about the coming of the kingdom of God. Those ideas are already there. So the Jesus aspect is like an afterthought, I think. It's something that was put in afterwards for Gentiles who wanted a nice little history to understand what happened. They had to give it flesh and blood, and they fleshed it out, and they made up this person because they were taking it literally. The difference between believing in these things in a metaphorical, spiritual way and believing literally, that you have to believe in this. So I see it as trying to convince more the Gentile and the converts of what was happening. It fits in also with the fact that everything became very literal at the end. I put it out there as food for thought.
About the rapid spread, it kind of reminds me of the Unification Church. Sun Myung Moon didn't just conjure it up out of nowhere like a rabbit out of a hat. It was exactly. His mutation of a widespread syncretistic Korean Presbyterian / Pentecostal movement, and there were other messiahs like what's his name, Kim, who was one of his lieutenants. He originally thought he was the Korean Messiah, but when he came in contact with the Reverend Moon, he figured, no, I yield. He's the one. And there were various of these groups that apparently must have united under Sun Myung Moon, and so he had a kind of ready-made sectarian movement to head up.
It's a perfect analogy. It's absolutely, that makes sense. I mean, take Alexander the Great of Macedonia. I'm not knocking what he did. 11 years and take over that empire from India to Egypt to Macedonia in 11 years with 30,000 men. Okay, he actually did that. But what people forget is there was already an empire there for him to take over. That empire had already been established by the Neo-Assyrians, by the Neo-Babylonians, and then by the Achaemenid Persians. All he had to do was replace the leadership, which is what he did. So he didn't actually take over that empire. He didn't create that empire. Okay, he just took over management. And I think the same thing happened with Christianity. I think Christianity is the same thing. The groundwork had already been done 200 years before, easily. There were Jewish groups who were already moving in that way. They'd established a new covenant with God. They were waiting for the end times because they could see that things were not going right. They were oppressed all the time. It makes perfect sense, and you just got to read the apocalyptic literature. You got to read some of the pseudepigrapha to see that it's all there. That stuff didn't pop out of the woodwork. It's been there for centuries. Yeah.
Well, think of, is it Acts 19 where Paul meets the 12 disciples? It's 18 or 19, I can never remember. And he says, did you receive the Holy Spirit when you believed? And they said, what's a Holy Spirit? And then, the John the Baptist thing. And he says, you guys are out of date here. The big thing has happened. The Messiah came. Well, okay, by all means, let's get on the bandwagon. I don't think that actually happened, but it has a kind of plausibility because it shows the kind of thing that must have been happening, that there were receptive groups who were already some kind of sectarians who said, hey, I bet you this is it. Or the same thing with the Baha'i faith. That really started with Mullah Hussein, I think his name was, who was a member of the Shaikhi sect. And Sheikh what? I don't know who he was, but they were waiting for the hidden imam to appear. And their criterion was it would have to be somebody that could understand the Surah of Joseph, which seemed to be a kind of a romance thing. And what's this doing in scripture? And so they were waiting for an allegorical meaning. And Mullah Hussein said, well, I can tell you what it means. I said, okay, we're off and running. And from this movement, there emerged Mirza Ali Muhammad, the Bab, who said, well, I'm preparing the way I'm the door to the hidden imam. He'll be along any time now. And he finally said, look, let me level with you. I'm the hidden imam. And but then he died, executed, and one of his disciples became Baha'u'llah, took over. But not everybody accepted him. I mean, it's a pattern of sectarian osmosis and multiplication by fission. It just happens again and again. So it's no surprise. Well, like Rodney Stark in his book, The Rise of Christianity, he says, look, it's no mystery how Christianity succeeded as quickly and as widely as it did. You can see the same thing with the Unification Church and the Mormons. And for the same reasons, it's really fascinating that this guy plugs in all the sociology you need to understand it. And rather than debunking this, I mean, one apologist, sort of a nut, was said, he basically made the argument, J.P. Holding, I think was his name, he said that Christianity must have appeared so stupid and repulsive to its contemporaries that, you see, it had to be the Holy Spirit who hypnotized all these people to convert to it. So the very stupidity and repulsiveness of it, it's just baloney, it's no miracle. And the irony of that approach is, no, we know of various great merits that the early Christians did have: manumitting slaves and rescuing the accident victims and stuff, whether or not they were Christians and so forth. There's a lot to be proud of. You don't establish Christianity by denigrating it, and it's so silly. The same way, if you can explain the rise of it, you're shedding light on it. You don't need miracles when you have virtues that explain it. Which would you rather have? And even this business about the contradictions. I did a book called When Gospels Collide, where I picked a bunch of gospel contradictions. And my point was always to say, what fundamentalists are afraid of is if you admit these are contradictions, you're saying that it couldn't be inspired because God wouldn't make these stupid mistakes. And my point is, hey, look, I'm defending the Bible, not you, because I can show very easily how these are all redactional changes to reapply the original material. It's the only one that really baffled me, and I'd love to see somebody do a book or dissertation on this. Why do they differ over who Peter was talking to when he denied Jesus? The gospel writers can't get that straight. A doorkeeper, a maid, the crowd, a different doorkeeper, a different maid, etc., etc. Why weren't they consistent? Especially if Matthew and Luke were working off of Mark, that I can't answer. I would love to hear somebody's view on that.
Maybe they weren't present. The story was made up.
Borrowed it from each other. I mean, Matthew uses Mark, so does Luke, apparently. And well, maybe this is a sign that that's not true. That it's much more complicated.
The point is, the whole denial thing is a story, is a narrative, and whether there was one cock crowing 3 times or 3 cocks crowing once doesn't really matter. It's a fact he denied. And it's a didactic narrative. I don't think it happened. It's not based on fact. It's based on teaching.
Right. Oh yeah.
And that's why you have contradiction. Yeah.
I'm just thinking, even if it was a fiction, why would they change that? It seems insignificant, unless there is some significance that is eluding me. But
this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that if you are in charge of a Christian group and you've got your sacred text, because not all Christian groups have the same text, obviously, we know that, and you can see these kind of serious disparities, you'd think that you do something about it. But they didn't, and that's the part I can't understand. I would expect things to be more aligned than they are. Unless, of course, the misalignment is due to the fact that there were so many different Christian groups, like the monarchists and the Donatists and the Decetists and all these different groups, that they kept pretty much to themselves, and they developed their own internal minhag or traditions, and they kept their own mistakes to themselves, if that makes sense. And only when all these texts were analyzed under one scrutiny to decide on what's going to go in and what's going to go out, which I believe happened in 380 at the Council of Rome. That's why what stayed in contains these errors. Maybe that's the explanation for it, because originally they came from different groups. I mean, I've read somewhere that before 380, the Gospel of John, for example, wasn't very popular. Some people wanted to chuck it out. And 380, it was canonized. So basically, a group of old men sitting around a table decide it's in or it's out. I mean, that's the fact of it. So your New Testament is put together by a bunch of old men, inspired by the Paracletos, the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. And the same Holy Spirit chucked those books out when Martin Luther was around. So the Holy Spirit changed the mind of God.
What's interesting about the Gospel of John is that the anti-Marcionite prologue of John, which a lot of scholars don't want to take that seriously, because goodness forbid it's telling the truth, that the Gospel of John was dictated to Papias, and Papias wrote it down. I actually think it could be true, because that would put it in the 2nd century, the original version of John, close to the mid-2nd century. And there are others I've talked to that are a couple of scholars I've talked to that believe the story is true. What were we about to say, Bob?
Robert Eisler, in one of his books, points out some tradition quotes something in early Christian writings where it says that John's amanuensis was Marcion, and that he said, okay, let's see what you got here. And he saw, huh, no one has ever seen God except the only begotten Son. What? And so forth. And he says, you're corrupting what I dictated. And he fired him. But if that could just be an explanation as to why there's Marcionite sounding stuff in John.
What's interesting about the anti-Marcionite prologue to John is it does mention Marcion reading the Gospel of John. It upset him, and then he started spreading a heresy, and John excommunicated him from the church, which would later lead. That was the first expulsion. So Marcion would later go to Rome after that, and have the bigger, more famous expulsion when he tried to preach his teachings down there. But what's interesting is that this story gets ignored, even though it indicates that John is 2nd century, because they want to keep John in the 1st century.
Right.
Oh, the anti-Marcionite prologue must have made a mistake. There's no way this is true. And then you have the Acts of Timothy. I was talking about this on the show. About Paul, all or nothing. It's how many Pauls, all or none. So on that show, I brought up the Acts of Timothy, and I was reading from, I think it's volume 1 of Tony Burke's New Testament pseudepigrapha or New Testament apocrypha. And in it talks about Timothy, one of Paul's co-authors, is still alive in the AD 90s. He was released from Roman custody, which completely contradicts the persecution narrative, by the way, and under Emperor Nerva. Then he dies in Trajan. I'm like, how does this fit with an AD 50s letter writer? I mean, this guy is living at the end of the 1st century. And I was like, hardly anyone's talking about this, because it puts Timothy's death super late. Oh, well, if the letters were misdated, which I think obviously are, we all free think that. I would say each of us might have some different reasons for it, but we come to that same conclusion. Well, if one of Paul's major co-authors is dying late in the game, well, that makes sense. And I think my belief is that these co-authors, Timothy, Silas, Sosthenes, Tertius, or Tertius, however you want to pronounce his name, they were working with this Saul of Giscala that Jerome's talking about. I think that's the one they were. That's my thinking. That's the one they were talking about. I can't think of anybody else that could fit. He was living after the war, as Jerome says. It happens to fit what we see in the Acts of Timothy dying late, and it happens to fit the tension in the canonical text, where you can see the temporal tension, where even though there are parts of it that look like it's pre-war, it clearly knows the war happened. The wrath of God is a past event. It's already happened. And let's think about it this way: with the war having happened, it would be easier for the church to expand, right? The zealots are wiped out. You see? The churches can expand. It's easier for them. It's easier for them to preach.
Also, you've got a stronger Pharisaic movement in Judaism who are far more open to belief in resurrection and afterlife, and a happier ending than Sadduceeism, which wouldn't accept any of that. So that would also make things easier. The rabbinical movement starts then, and it's definitely it's a fresher approach. It would also help. I'd see all the books in the New Testament as snowballs, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
They start with a grain of sand, and they roll through the centuries, and eventually we end up with them today, and we look at them and we date them. But there's not one date here. There are layers of dates. It's very difficult to. As I say, I go back to art. If you look at the art, Jesus was still a teacher in the 2nd century. He only becomes divine at the end of the 3rd century, and by the 4th century, he starts taking off the ground like Elon Musk's spaceship. Okay, he takes off the halo, his feet off the ground, and he starts becoming bigger, and everybody else becomes smaller. and he starts to grow a beard because of the influence of other deities. He takes over, Zeus and Serapis. He starts getting a beard. He becomes more manly, more adult. That happens because he's now a god. He was not a god in the 2nd century. So if the text tells you he was a god in the 2nd century, there's a problem.
Fascinating.
It reminds me, like, the woman caught up in adultery in the Gospel of John was a 5th century addition to the Gospel. We know that from the manuscript tradition, that the addition of the woman caught up in adultery is a super late tack on to the Gospel. The longer ending of Mark was added too. The Armenian Church preserves a tradition in their manuscripts that Aristion in the AD 130s, that Aristion wrote the longer ending of Mark. And what's interesting is that Papias mentions him. And so when he's talking about Aristion's Logia or Diegesis, I actually think it's just the longer ending of Mark. And Aristion signed his name. He admitted that, yeah, I wrote this. So when in the transmission, his name got removed because that was inconvenient. Like, okay, well, we need to make it look like the longer ending and the short ending were written by the same guy. So let's remove the confession that he wrote onto the text, that he wrote it. We can't have that. It'd be sort of like somebody removing Tertius as co-author of Romans because he shows up in Romans 16, which nobody did because he's still there. Although he's not in Marcion's version of Romans. He's gone, as are the co-authors. Not their names completely, but the role as co-authors are obliterated in Marcion's version. And I wonder if Marcion was trying to harmonize canonical Paul with pre-war lost Paul, whatever the hell that was. I think that pre-war Paul collection that Clement never says it's a collection. He only mentions one letter. So I don't know. I don't know what Clement knows, what the sources are.
Just a little quick interjection. Am
Sure.
I right? Marcion believed that Jesus was a spirit, right?
Yeah, he believed that Jesus ascended from heaven in his antithesis.
So he wasn't. This is a Gnostic idea. He wasn't material, which means he would have been sinful, right? He was spirit, pure ghost, phantom, right?
Well, there's a possibility, since he did believe Jesus suffered on the cross. Some people have suggested, well, to use my analogy, that he must have taught something like, I think Caspar Schwenkfeld during the Reformation did, that Jesus had a body made of celestial material.
But it wasn't physis in the Greek sense. It wasn't physis. Sorry, it wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't physis. It wasn't stuff of the physical world, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Because
he wasn't made of the form
as soon as you have flesh, then you are automatically evil.
Yeah.
In that system. And the reason why I'm asking this is I'm just asking an open question here. You were trying to find out why he was going back to Paul, and I was wondering, Paul, if you take Paul at face value, he didn't meet Jesus. He admits that. He never talks about Jesus as a person. We never get a feeling that he knew anything about his family life. He talks about Jesus in a very abstract way, almost as though he's a spiritual being. That's the impression I get. He does talk about crucifixion, so you could argue that he's seeing physical there. But apart from that one statement, one gets the feeling that Paul is talking about a supernatural being, that Jesus is something esoterical, which makes him sound very Gnostic.
Yeah.
Because under Gnosticism, Jesus or Christ, the Christus would be an emanation of the monad. And by accepting this emanation, you sitting in the demiurge could enter into the pleroma through Christ, accessing through him, because he becomes then the means between the two worlds, the world of the upper world of the pleroma of light and the lower one of the physical world. And as you know, where the two cross over, you end up with a fish shape, which is called the vesica pisces. And that is the area where Christ intercedes. He's both God and man. And we move from being sarkic, fleshly, and we become pneumatic. And then we enter into Christ. That's the Gnostic system, which the Christians borrowed. And it would make sense that Marcion was interested in Paul, because if I was reading Paul without knowing anything else, I would think Paul was talking about a spiritual being, because he doesn't talk about Jesus as a real person. He doesn't talk about his family or what he ate or what he did in his spare time. As you opened your statement at the beginning of this talk, we know nothing about the man, except what's been added later.
Well, Jermaine, what you just said in Colossians, which strikes me as just out and out Gnostic, we hear that in Christ the pleroma of the Godhead dwells bodily, and then we're told that Christ in you is the hope of glory. That sounds pretty darn Gnostic to me.
Gnosticism, pure and simple. I mean, some of these people had a very interesting way of looking at it. I mean, there are different types of Gnosticism, but the one I really like is that the Christ, the Christus, was the highest that you could be as a person. Okay, the highest state that you could attain to. So all of us can become the Christ. In other words, we were all elevated to the Christ level through hard work and devotion and faith and whatever. And the Gnosticism, as you know, is spiritual knowledge, not fact knowledge, but spiritual awareness, spiritual knowledge that you get from being allowed to enter into this union with the emanation. And it's a very strong and powerful symbolism, and it also, of course, overlaps with something that Plato said. It's not quite the same thing, but it's a similar idea that you have the physis is the natural world which you can do nothing about, and it's perfect, and as he said, he believed in the place where there were perfect forms, geometry is perfect, it's all good. He uses the word the good. And we are unfortunately stuck in the nomos, which is the interpretation, the human laws, the way we interpret things that we see, which is all false and misunderstood. And then our job is to use our brains, our intellect, to climb out of this hole and get back into the physis, get back to the light, which is a very similar idea, which I think there's crossovers between Gnosticism and that idea. But bottom line, that influenced Christianity. There's no doubt about it. Even to the point of drawing a fish in the sand with a stick when you spoke to another Christian. I mean, that is actually a ripoff of the Vesica Pisces, which is the interface between the macrocosm and the microcosm, or the pleroma and the demiurge. And they also started to believe that the God of the Old Testament was evil because he had made stuff. The monad was beyond your comprehension, and that was the God of the New Testament.
It's like a Venn diagram, the fish diagram. The idea of becoming Christ I think that underlies the sacrament of the bridal chamber that we're told Valentinians and some Jewish Christians practiced, in which you encountered as a bride, you're the bride of Christ, and what you are encountering in the bridal chamber is your own higher self, which is the risen Christ. And that in turn reflects the old Zoroastrian thing that you have a guardian angel, which is the highest version of you, that the angels are you. And individuals, like when Peter is rescued from death row, and he comes, I love this story, he comes to where his followers are praying for his delivery, and it's Rhoda is so overcome she doesn't even open the door, goes in and says, "You're not going to believe this, it's Peter." And they say, "Nah, it must be his angel." Well, in other words, it looks like him because it's his higher self. And so he must be dead, and it's his angel coming to say goodbye. And what's so funny about it is, here are these great prayer warriors interceding for Peter, and it doesn't even cross their mind that their prayer might have been answered. It's hilarious. I'm just sure that's intentional satire. But at any rate, I think that idea that, yeah, your guardian angel is your higher self, which is the risen Christ. And this is where the two become one in enlightenment. And here's a place where this stupid idea of angels showing up in the back seat of your car, and these stupid, it's just ridiculous, like little Valentine cherubs. No, the original Zoroastrian derived thing is incredibly profound, but nah, we don't want to have to deal with that.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
I'm going to take some super chats. I've been waiting quite a while. We'll start with Israelite Christianity. Thank you for your super chat. Contrary to the claims the New Testament offers, there are no prophecies about Yeshua in the Old Testament.
Right. Oh,
yeah.
yes.
I think you'll get an agreement from all of us here on that one.
What else is new?
Right. Nothing new, bud. Israelite Christianity again. Thank you for another super chat. However, Isaiah, Micah, Daniel, the Psalms, and other books of the Bible contain texts borrowed from very ancient prophecies about Yeshua. Okay, now you lost me. Where are you getting that now?
People must understand that the New Testament authors deliberately dipped into the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible and took out stuff that they could use to claim was prophetic. And you can actually do, in my book, I do this in great detail, but you can do it yourselves. Just take any prophecy in the New Testament, and it invariably says, as it was written, and then you go and look for it. It doesn't exist. Or if it exists, it's in a completely different context. Okay? It's just a way of speaking to give authority to what you're saying. If I can say to you, this is true because it was written, go and read so-and-so, he backs me up, it sounds more plausible. And that's why it's done. It's an old trick. And that's why a lot of the early church fathers had a problem, because they didn't like Jews, all right? But they wanted the respect of Jewish literature to back up what they were doing. So they were caught in the crossroads between being anti-Semitic and also wanting to praise the Old Testament. It's an interesting situation they ended up in.
Well, isn't this kind of like the Habakkuk commentary in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they knew that the text literally meant one thing and that was over with? But it's not, the scripture's not just a museum relic, it speaks anew because the teacher of righteousness showed us how to ferret out the esoteric meaning that couldn't even have been recognized except in retrospect.
Yeah.
Once
you're talking about Pesharim. You're talking about Pesharim. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Habakkuk gets often used there because Habakkuk was written during the Babylonian time, and the Kettim referred to the Babylonian
the commentary.
Yeah, the oppressors were called Kettim. But when you go now to the Roman times, the Kettim become the Romans. They use these terms, but we all know Babylon is Rome. Kettim means the Romans, you know. And some people suggest that they wrote like that so that they wouldn't get caught talking badly about their oppressors. That's one possibility. But of course, it's couched in these sort of quasi-religious terms. It makes it sound very spooky, you know. It makes it sound more more esoteric. You know?
The more ambiguous, the more useful.
Yeah, it's an old trick to make something sound like it's what's the word I'm looking for? It's like many religions, for example, love to express themselves in an ancient text or an ancient language that's now dead. So in Zoroastrianism, for example, they use They use my brain's going to Avestan. Okay, there's old Avestan, middle Avestan, and new Avestan. They use Pahlavi, Middle Persian, and it just gives the text a sort of an authority because it sounds. But people who actually say these mantras and these prayers don't even know what they're reading. It's a bit like I notice it when I'm in the shul. I mean, most of the people in the shul don't speak Hebrew, but they do all the prayers because it sounds good, you know. And same in the Catholic Church. What it used to be, you spoke Latin. It makes it more. It sounds more. What's the word I'm give it? Gives it gravitas to have. And you find that it's the same. It's the same with people who like to read. They'll only read the Bible if it's the King James version because they want to read. They want it in Stuart English because thee and thou sounds more impressive than you.
Yeah.
It's the same
the
thing.
extreme case of that is speaking in tongues. You don't know what you're saying, but it has an impressive sound. I'm speaking in the tongues of angels. So you don't need to understand it. The mere fact of what you're doing shows that, oh, this guy's inspired, which is true in a psychological sense. Presumably they're, groanings that cannot be uttered or whatever. Not being a glossalist myself, I mean, I speak plenty of nonsense, but in at least in intelligible languages.
Derek, thank you for your super chat. He says, "Great show, gents." Thanks, Derek.
I like a show like this because this is more like what we would do if we were actually sitting having a sundowner, and there's no pressure. There's no pressure. Just talk. I like that. The trouble is, I'm sure somebody will be offended, and they must realize that. Well, I personally have a provisional state of understanding, and I've said this before. That means that if somebody can come into my room and prove to me that the Earth is flat, I'll believe it.
Yeah,
but they better have pretty good evidence. Okay, so that's how I work. I don't sit there and have one belief system and say that's it fixed forevermore, because the next second I find something better explanation. Right. That's why I'm a scientist. Science works on that principle. We don't have all the answers, but we try honestly to get them, and it requires an ethical approach. Okay, if you're not prepared to do the hard work, then you're not going to get the answers. End of story.
Jayon, thank you for your thumbs up in the super chat. Appreciate it. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. You are right, Mr. Price. Went through the New Oxford Annotated Bible, and yes, Paul indeed thought Jesus would return in his lifetime. How to remind myself of that? It's so obvious. Shocks me all over again.
Yeah, this came up earlier on another program. He said, where does Paul actually say he thought the end would come in his own lifetime? Oh, 1 Thessalonians.
Do you guys remember the Jesus seminars?
Oh, yeah, I was a member until they became an arm of the Democratic Party.
So you have 200 people from all walks of life, and they have to come up with a consensus opinion about what Jesus actually said or didn't say. All right? I actually have the book here. It's quite interesting. It's the four gospel, actually 5 gospel. I've got Thomas in it as well. And then you've got the red and the black and the gray and the pink, depending on whether he said it, might have said it, never said it. Okay. They were actually told before they voted that whatever you do, do not say that Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet.
Yeah, they
were worried about their jobs because most of them are ministers, so they actually made that a condition before the vote. So this is not actually a consensus opinion at all. It's a manufactured opinion based on a ruling. Okay.
Yeah, that must have been before I joined up in '94.
Yeah. So,
but I do know they hated that.
If Yeshua Bar Yosef was an historical person, and I don't doubt he may have existed, and he really did go out and preach the end times and get your act together and get back to God, that all makes sense. And there's enough embarrassment in the New Testament to tell me that he was only interested in Israelites, Judahites. He actually says that a couple of times. He says, I'm not here for the others. I'm only here for my own people in the story. So Jesus wasn't there for the Gentiles. He actually says it. Okay. There was a thing where he with the crumbs on the table, you might remember, which get brushed off underneath. And he says, I'm only here for basically my own people. End of story. Okay. Now, if that person existed, I think he would have been quite a difficult character to get to know. I think he would have been quite cutting. I don't think he would have been very popular. I don't think he walked around with a smile on his face. And what happened was he preached the end times. Okay? And obviously his disciples believed that he was going to come back in their own lifetime. We know that. And when he didn't, the church then changed the story that the second coming is still coming. But that's an addition much later. The facts are, in terms of what he preached, he is a failed apocalyptic prophet because nothing he preached actually happened. What every prophet said.
Albert Schweitzer admitted that. He said, you got to be willing to face that.
Yeah.
When the first time I went to the Jesus seminar, I said, I got an idea for you. There's the red bead for you. Jesus certainly said it. There's the pink one. There's some room for doubt, but he probably did. There's the gray one. It looks a little unlikely, but you can't rule it out. The black one, no way. I said, I think there should also be a purple one, meaning Jesus did say it, but he was just kidding. Give away all you own. Had to go in there, didn't I? Turn the other cheek. Just kidding, don't worry.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, that's good.
I tell you what, if you could give me a copy of the 5 Gospels, including the Nakamadi Gospel of Thomas, I'd buy that.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Call it the purple text. Yeah.
Oh, like that. Alas, they never went along.
It'll be a very short book, by the way.
Well, I did.
Speaking of the Gospel of Thomas,
dubious database, where I took all the stuff they said Jesus probably did say or do, and showed that by the same criteria they used on the ones they debunked, these should have gone into the bin also. The same problems arise with all of them.
Yeah, the point is you cannot have a scientific result on consensus. It's a failed project. And a lot of those people who were there for their consensus weren't even properly trained people. They were people from all walks of life. It wasn't you had a few scholars there, but there was also dominees and pastors from local churches. It wasn't a group of people who'd spent the last 30 years really studying this stuff in any great detail.
Actually, so what they had was there was this outer, we all actually sat at a square of tables put together, and there were about 70 something scholars, of whom I guess more than half would show up at any given meeting. We would all debate the things, and then the audience, who were big fans of it and well educated into this stuff, but not professionally, they would ask questions.
They would vote.
But they were kept separate. You would have the fellows vote and then the associates vote. So they didn't combine.
Vote went into the book? What vote went into the final gospel that was published?
Just that of the scholars, as far as I remember.
All right. So it would have had more validity than just the.
Yeah.
Because I was told there were 200 votes taken.
No, it wasn't done that way. Though I have to say the people were very literate, surprisingly well studied in it, but they had a separate vote count, and it wasn't combined.
Well, that's good. That's good to know. That's good to know.
Yeah.
What's interesting about the Gospel of Thomas? I wanted to say this earlier, but now that it's been brought back up, I think this is the perfect time for me to bring it up. In speaking of Gospels being rolling text, additions being added to it over time. And then the original text, it seems to be kept because of either carelessness or some other reason. So the contradiction is formed. We see this in the Gospel of Thomas. There's multiple examples of it. At least a third of it has this problem. And in Cyril of Jerusalem, a church father living in the 4th century, he says that Thomas was written in the 3rd century, but there was Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century that already knew about the Gospel of Thomas. In the 2nd century, Papias referred to a logia.
Quite an old writing. It's quite an old writing, yeah.
It referred to a logia of Thomas. So Thomas is actually a much older text. So there's evidence that, based on that, I concluded that Thomas was written at least twice. The second time is when these additions were added in the 3rd century, and Cyril tells us it was Thomas the Manichaean in the 3rd century that added these additions to the text. Now I'm just going to give one example.
Jacob, don't forget, Thomas is a Gnostic writing. It's pure Gnosticism. That's another problem. It's not an historical book. Yeah.
Well, if you look at saying 46, it says, Jesus said from Adam to John the Baptizer, no one's been born who's so much greater than John the Baptizer, but they shouldn't avert their eyes. Then it says, but I say that whomever among you will become a little child will know the kingdom and become greater than John. It's an oxymoron. There's either never going to be anyone greater than John, or there's a way to do it. So I would say that
born greater. It seems to me the
last half of it was added.
Recently, the least schlumph in the kingdom of God scores higher than John. That has to be a Christian qualification / rejection of what must have been an original John the Baptist movement slogan. John the Baptist, the greatest human being ever born, because we know from the pseudo-Clementines that the John the Baptist crowd would throw this in the teeth of Christians. Hey, if your guy said John was the greatest man ever born, that kind of includes Jesus too, doesn't it? So that to me stands as the original version of saying, and the Christians later decided, well, let's build in a refutation of that. Nonetheless, as great as he was, he's nothing compared to the least church bulletin folder in the kingdom. And that's otherwise, it's just, it doesn't make any sense to me. So I think it's really an appropriated slogan from a creedal item from John the Baptist's group.
And then if you look earlier in the Gospel of Thomas, it talks about James being the successor to Jesus, which is like, okay, so the original Gospel of Thomas, you get rid of the super Gnostic additions to the text. Was like super crude or representing an early tradition in which James was important. It has Jesus saying that the heavens and the earth were made for the sake of James the just. So James succeeds Jesus, which also the pseudo-Clementines suggest that. And so James is viewed as a lot more important in these texts than in the canonical texts. In the canonical text, he gets kind of superseded by Peter. In a non-canonical text, Peter is put in the middle between Jesus and James, when James was originally straight up the successor of Jesus. But anyway, enough of that. I'm going to bring up this other super chat that we got. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for the super chat. There was a vote for or against Jesus being a failed apocalyptic prophet. When did this happen?
I'm not sure, but it was before I was involved, and it was very clear that most of the fellows of the seminar that expressed an opinion said, no, Jesus was like a cynic sage. He was not an apocalyptic prophet. That was foisted on him in retrospect when they were trying to push the conditions of the Jewish revolt period back into the time of Jesus. And Paul Verhoeven, the film director, he has a PhD, and he was a fellow of the seminar. and he was working on a Jesus movie. I don't think he ever did it, but he would report to us, because this would have been, the only Jesus movie that was based on real scholarship. But Paul committed the sin of thinking that Jesus was some kind of a zealot. And the other fellows were always trying to persuade him, no, we don't think that. We think he was just a wisdom teacher, not an apocalyptist. I don't know whatever happened because I stopped going. But I told Paul Verhoeven if he ever made the movie, he ought to make that.
The point is, if you're basing this on the meaning of the Greek apocalypsis, it doesn't mean a fiery, horrible, bloody end to the world with earthquakes and dragons flying around. It actually means a revelation, a wise revelation, which normally comes to a sage, somebody who has a different way of seeing the world and tries to teach it to other people. So this person gets enlightened and then he tries to pass this on to other people. The apocalyptic age was all about this, trying to understand what God was actually thinking and doing, because, as I say, the Jews were realizing that they were not getting a fair deal. I mean, you think about it for a moment. They were under Egyptian oppression from about 1550 right up to 1120. Then they had a few years of, while they were still under Canaanite influence. Then you have, from 900 onwards, you have Neo-Assyrian oppression, where they were forced to speak Aramaic. That's where Hebrew comes from. All right. So Hebrew is actually the language of oppression. Like under apartheid South Africa, Afrikaans was considered to be the language of oppression to the black people. All right. They didn't want Afrikaans because it was forced on them by the whites. It's exactly the same. The Jews, they were forced to speak a language, okay, which wasn't their language. It was used for trade because the Syrians were very clever. They managed to get everybody to speak this lingua franca so they could unify people. They were taken over by the Neo-Babylonians, who continued the practice. Then we have the Achaemenid Persians, who gave them maybe a slightly better deal. They let them rebuild their temple, but they were still a vassal, still subjugated to Persian rule. Then we have Alexander the Great. He wasn't very nice. Then you've got the Seleucids, who are all, basically the aftermath of the breakup of that empire. And then they have a few years under the Hasmoneans, and then the Romans come. So these people haven't really had a good deal, okay? I think they were getting tired of being told, remember what God did for you, remember what he did for you when you were slaves in Egypt. That wears a bit thin after a couple of thousand years. You've got to realize that these people wanted desperately to believe in Yahweh. They desperately wanted to see some resolution. They were not sinning anymore. They were not worshipping idols. So what the hell was going on? They wanted to see some justice. And it only made sense to them. But Yahweh obviously had a plan. These are the end times. He's going to get rid of the Romans, the New Jerusalem. Everyone's going to be happy. And that was very much a strong undercurrent for the last 150 years of the last era. And if you see it like that, you realize where these ideas come from. It's the apocalyptic era grows out of that. It's frustration, actually. You just read. You read any of the deuterocanonical books or apocryphal books. Read the Book of Judith or Susanna or the 2 Maccabees, 1 Maccabees. You read it. There are so many different theologies being experimented with in those texts. They're all trying to be Jewish, but they're all borrowing stuff from other religions. You see bits of Zoroastrianism, you see Hellenistic ideas. While they're fighting the Hellenists, they're using Hellenism against Hellenization. I mean, it's ironic.
Classic for revitalization movements. Like when Ayatollah Khomeini took over in '79, he wanted good old medievalism, but that didn't stop him from using modern communications technology. And the threatened culture always adopts the technology of the colonizers to turn against them. And that's kind of what happened here.
The Celtic peoples did it to the Romans. After 300 years, they learned Latin and they learned the language of their technology and they turned the tables on them. That's what happens. But
Yeah.
it's
I think apocalyptic was a kind of a theodicy because they couldn't admit that God failed them and he just didn't care about them. So they had to say, we must be doing something wrong. And so they came up with these things like, if all Israel would keep the Sabbath perfectly, one time the Messiah would come. So that explains why he ain't coming. Nobody's going to do that. This reminds me of a Saturday Night Live skit. I get a lot of theology out of the old programs. The police arrive on Christmas morning to a suburban home, and there's the Christmas tree, and the kids are wailing and crying. And the police say, "Oh, somebody stole all your Christmas presents." They said, "No, that's not what happened." He said, "What?" And the more the dad talks, he says, we just weren't good enough this year. We thought sure we were, and that Santa would reward us with presents, but I guess we screwed up." And the kids are saying, "What? And the cops are saying, "What's the matter with this guy?" And so the police leave, and they say, "Okay, kids, I know this is disappointing, but we just got to double down." Like the idiot parents still believed in Santa and thought it was their fault. Well, that's the same thing with apocalyptic. We've been as devout and pious as we could, but I guess we screwed up someplace. We weren't quite good enough, or God would have intervened like Santa. And you're never going to win that. You can't be perfect. You can't be perfect as that. I mean, they set the bar high so that only God can jump it, knowing that we can't. So it's a way to say, well, let's just like it or lump it forever. It's always going to be this way, unless somehow we all repent. That's not very likely.
Well, I think we can close here. And I just want to tell everybody real quick that the links to purchase Nicholas and Bob's books will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Nicholas and Bob, thank you both for joining me today.
It's an absolute pleasure, Jacob. Thank you.
Oh, what a pleasure. What a privilege.
Are we still on the air?
I'm about to play the outro now. 1 second.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.